Very pleased and thankful for Lucia to be kicking us off with this first online All Souls seminar ever. She's the guinea pig before next week, where we're going to have Dr. Abena Azulu-Bempa, who is also here watching Lucia, and Abena is going to be speaking to us from the LSE. So we're going to learn how this all works today, and you will have seen from the email out about this that we have assumed that online seminars are probably better, a little bit shorter than normal. So Lucia, I think, will talk for about half an hour, and then there'll be half an hour of questions. I've just realized I forgot to record it. I will now, or maybe it's already doing it. No, it's already doing it. I am the weakest link here. I'm about to mute myself and hand over to Lucia.
Okay, well, thanks, Mary, and thanks for making me the guinea pig. I should say that I was chosen as the least technologically competent member of the centre. So if I can make this work, we're really good for the future. All right, so my talk is the safety relation, risk prevention and conditional citizenship in post-welfare societies. And I would just say up front that this was a paper that I wrote for a completely different audience, namely a conference in Oslo in middle of March on Nordic penal punishment, or no, sorry, Nordic punishment at the crossroads. And the question was, for those attending the conference, is are Nordic societies at a crossroads where they have choices to make in the face of increasing concern around risk, prevention, security, and increasing punitivism? And what does the future hold for Scandinavian punishment? So I have stripped out quite a lot of the paper and cut back on the content that I had, particularly for a Nordic audience. But what I'll give you now is, and I tried this out yesterday, and I found that there was about a 10 or 12-second delay between me pressing the next slide and that actually happening on another computer. So perhaps, Mary, you could wave if I've started. I'll press. So have you now got the next slide? Yep. Oh, okay, so, and Carolyn has too, so let's hope everybody has. It's happening more rapidly than it did at home. Good. So this is just a very brief overview of what the paper's going to talk about, and because none of you are hard of learning or hard of reading, I'll let you read it for yourselves rather than bore you by reading it all out. Basically, the core of the paper is to reflect on what happens to relations between the state and the citizen when conditions change, and not least when we move from, broadly speaking, welfare societies to post-welfare societies, and what it is that safety and public order and public protection mean in post-welfare societies, and what should that term mean, and what are the implications for citizenship. And a big theme in the paper is the ways in which citizenship and rights of belonging and membership change as societies change, and are we at risk of creating what I've called conditional citizens. And I should say now, apologies to any of you who think that some of this sounds a bit familiar. It builds upon, she said, trying to sound positive, a paper that I gave over a year ago in the centre for a book which I've written as yet not a single word, but hope to start doing sometime soon. Okay, so here are the very brief reflections on Nordic exceptionalism. And suffice to say that there is a kind of common perception that Nordic countries are different from other countries, that they're less reliant on punitive policies, that they're more welfarist, that they have a greater commitment to rehabilitation. The question then arises, as the conditions change, and not least, as I'll go on to point out, as we live in an increasingly globalized world, does the rise of risk, does the rise of greater punitivism create a different kind of society which places a big question mark over the supposedly kind of inclusive and welfarist approaches that have historically been taken by Nordic societies? Whereas the kind of common view is that in Nordic societies, and particularly working on the back of studies by people like Vanessa Barker, in Sweden, whereas historically Nordic societies have been very inclusionary in respect to their own citizens, but so Barker argues at a cost to non-citizens who are suffer a kind of relative exclusion and detriment under those circumstances of welfarism. As we move in the Nordic realm from welfare-based approaches to more post-welfarist or neoliberal societies, will the conditions of inclusion for citizens, if not non-citizens, will those conditions change? And what are the possible futures for Nordic penal policy and practice? And at the heart of asking that question, I placed what I call the safety relation. The safety relation is an idea well known to political theorists, going all the way back to the 17th century. And there's a quote there which you can read for yourselves from Thomas Hobbes. But an idea which is developed all the way through, most particularly through the Enlightenment period in the 18th century, the idea that there is a social contract between the state and the citizen, which provides us with conditions of good order and safety, and saves us from having a life which is infamously nasty, brutish, and short. That's not a description of any of our colleagues, by the way. And that we move from this state of nature into a more ordered state where the sovereign state acts as a guarantor of order. It provides safety, it provides protection, in return for which we as citizens agree to submit to state authority. I said under the criminal law, but of course that's under any law. It just so happens we're crims and that's what we're concerned about. And in the kind of earlier versions of this, in Hobbes and Rousseau and so on, there's a very clear idea of a sovereign state or a monarch or whatever. I think as we move forward in time and think about kind of modern democratic societies, we're less thinking about a sovereign power or an authoritarian power than as a political democracy in which citizens form a political community in which we hold each other to be mutually accountable to one another. And we call each other to account for our wrongdoing through the criminal law, through policing, through the criminal process and punishment. And the very idea of criminal responsibility comes from the idea of gosh, very strange things happening on my screen, but I'll ignore them. Oh, somebody seems to be drawing lines around my screen. Okay, we call each other to account. The idea of responsibility is about being responsive, answerable for our wrongdoing. But that still leaves open, I think, a question about what we actually mean by safety, and again, that's something that's been a subject of quite a lot of debate. For the purposes of this talk, I've simplified it down to two basic ideas. One of which is much discussed in the work of the American political philosopher theorist Jeremy Waldron, where he takes issue with what he calls a pure safety conception. And by pure safety conception, he means the idea, I mean, we might actually just call it law and order politics, the idea that actually the kind of safety that we're asking the state to provide for us is just about keeping us safe, keeping our persons safe, our property, ensuring public order. And he takes issue with that and questions whether that's really what we want, and what the adverse implications of pursuing a pure safety conception might be for a modern democratic state. And that's juxtaposed with another idea which has become very popular actually amongst political and criminal law theorists, which is the idea of civil peace. And again, the idea of civil peace is quite a kind of historic idea. It goes back even to the kind of earlier 17th, 18th century ideas of the king's peace. Or we might say civil order is, if you like, a synonym for civil peace. The idea that we're not simply trying to keep ourselves safe in a very narrow sense, but that civility and civil order requires the flourishing of a political community under the rule of law. and that we would prefer a society in which the means by which we go about trying to secure safety are actually consistent with this more kind of elevated idea of a flourishing democratic political community which abides by precepts of legality and ensures the legitimacy of state actions, particularly state policing. So whereas under the pure safety model you get more security laws, preventive measures, the criminal law expands, you're willing to sacrifice due process rights in the name of security or safety, and you resort rather readily to punitivism. A model of civil peace has, if you like, a kind of rather more elevated idea of creating conditions for human flourishing, referencing the work of John Finnis, but also having reference to ideas of the legitimacy of the criminal process and the adherence with precepts of legality and so on. That then leaves a big question mark around how we resolve tensions between the two. On the one hand, this pure safety conception, on the other, the idea of civil peace. And I think increasingly, in my mind, it also raises questions about who decides what constitutes civil peace, who gets to decide what constitutes civility. And I'll give some examples of that at the moment. And I think at the moment, a lot of my criminal law theorist colleagues have got kind of so hooked up on the idea of civil peace as being a wonderful thing. They haven't yet done what criminologists are inclined to do, which is really try and think through, well, who enforces civil peace, and who gets to define what does and doesn't constitute civility, what constitutes, for example, antisocial behavior, and how we go about actually upholding those kinds of ideas. So that's kind of internal debate. And then, of course, externally, we should be aware of the fact that the very idea of the nation state is coming under threat under conditions of globalization. I wrote all of this while the coronavirus was ongoing, but before we got to the state that we now find ourselves in. And actually it's quite interesting to reflect back on it, and also quite salutary to realize how things that seem perfectly sensible and self-evident when one writes them can very, very rapidly be changed. So the idea that the nation state is a bordered political community of citizens bound by shared values is one which many scholars of globalization has suggested has come under threat as the world globalizes. Once you've got large mobile, presently not so mobile populations, where you've got mass mobility and not least supranational laws, what are the implications of that for state sovereignty and the state-citizen relationship? How does that impact upon the state and its assertion of sovereignty? And actually, I'm just, again, as an aside, going to risk running over time if I do this, but anyway, I mean, it's quite interesting how, for example, within the European Union, the idea of privileging mobility and having borderless countries quickly disappears in the light of an emergency when the borders come back down. It's a reassertion, if you like, of state sovereignty. So it's interesting to reflect how quickly things can change. The question under conditions of globalization is, can the state-citizen nexus, that relationship, that contract, still survive in the same ways? And I think it has quite interesting implications that play out differently in welfare societies. As I indicated earlier, we have this idea that the state is there to protect its citizens, to provide welfare for its citizens, to rely on rehabilitative penal policies for its citizens, but it casts non-citizens much more readily, I think, as outsiders. And one can see that in the very disproportionate numbers of people who are foreigners incarcerated in Nordic prisons, particularly in Sweden. Whereas I want to suggest that in post-welfare, so-called insecurity societies, and I borrowed that term from Peter Ramsey, to whom I'll return in a second. In post-welfare insecurity societies, citizenship itself becomes conditional, not simply on holding a passport, passport, but upon the ways in which people behave and the degree to which they're able to conform with the idea of civil peace or civility. So what happens in post-welfare states, and one of the things I think that chiefly happens is that we become rather less tolerant of non-conformity, we become less tolerant of risk. And that's partly because there's the safety net of social welfare. And we make greater demands on the state for protection, for safety. And to return to Peter Ramsey's work, Peter Ramsey in his book, The Insecurity State, talks about the idea of vulnerable citizenship, where vulnerable citizens are those who regard themselves as the worthy recipients of state protection, not simply from serious threats of crime, of theft, bodily assault, or whatever, but even of the lowest levels of incivility or disorder. They need to be protected from things which call into question their already rather precarious sense of insecurity. So you get calls for so-called reassurance policing, or as the picture on the right, yeah, it is the right, illustrates what's sometimes been called big hug policing, where big hug policing is really less about actually doing anything that might reduce crime or disorder or antisocial behaviour, but more about people feeling better about themselves, about vulnerable citizens feeling assured. And as I've suggested, that's driven partly by the idea that people are anxious and they need reassurance, but it's also, I think, giving in, if you like, to a rising intolerance of difference. And one might suggest that also informs discussions around migration and migrant communities and tolerance for differences of religious belief and so on. And going slightly off topic, and also some of the kind of political intolerance of the rise of the extreme right in UK politics, I think. So how does that play out then in policy and practice? Well, so under we no longer have the ASBO in the UK, which was infamously problematic, but we do have under the 2014 Antisocial Behaviour Act quite extensive so-called community rights of review. So you can pull what's called a community trigger, and if you do that as a vulnerable citizen, you have the right for review of the problem that you think you've identified. Anybody who belongs to a neighbourhood watch scheme will know that there are some of our neighbours, our friends, our colleagues, whatever, who are very ready to see risks and threats even on suburban streets. I think it's significant that the community trigger, the right of review, set out in the 2014 Act, is actually described by the government as a safety net for victims. So as you pull away the safety net of the welfare state, you create new safety nets, which individual citizens can, if you like, invoke for their own protection. Added to which we've got this whole language of safeguarding, the safeguarding agenda for vulnerable adults, children, and even students, in the creation, as you'll be well aware, of safe spaces on campus. And my illustration is perhaps a little bit cheeky, but this idea that safe spaces are, I don't doubt that they're important, that we should create places where people feel able to talk. I do worry, however, for the implications for freedom of speech on campus. And this then has all sorts of effects on the way citizenship itself is constructed. So we create what I want to call conditional citizens, where instead of citizenship being something as of right, it's something that is conditional upon conduct. And Lacey, in her most recent book, In Search of Responsibility, talks about how welfare provision has been replaced by what she calls technologies of responsibility. And by technologies of responsibility, she means the whole set of provisions which responsibilize, to borrow from David Garland, individuals to police themselves, to take responsibility for their own behavior. And that connotes, I think, a very striking shift, because if one thinks about the whole raft of preventive orders from ASBOs and then through to the creation of a huge slew, actually, of so-called preventive orders. I think Andrew Ashworth and I counted 30 preventive orders when we wrote our book in 2014. There are probably more now. What those are orders that exist in civil law, so they can be proven on balance of probabilities. Some of them are actually really not even civil orders, they're just executive, so they can be imposed by councils without any proof as such. I can talk about that later if you want. And those orders don't try to focus on the causes of civil disorder. They simply try to respond to and curtail its effects. So they impose prohibitions on individuals who are antisocial. They have prescriptions to, for example, weed your front garden or remove rubbish from your front yard, or whatever. They impose curfews, and then penalties for breach, which are financial penalties in the first instance, but backed up by imprisonment for non-payment. The result of which is to create a whole series of categories of what I call precarious citizenship. And these, one could cut them up in many different ways, but for the sake of this paper, we might talk about marginalized citizens, the young, the poor, the unemployed, the mentally ill, whose access to what was previously the welfare state is much limited, and whose rights of citizenship are curtailed. Then we might think about irregular citizens, those that fail or indeed struggle to comply with norms of civility and order, antisocial young people, people with drug and alcohol dependencies, whose behaviour doesn't accord with notions of civility. And then, I'm not very happy about this term, so I'd welcome alternatives. Inadequate citizens. I think inadequate is actually problematic, because what I really mean is these are categories of people who appear to fail to comply with norms of order, precisely because those norms are impossible for them to fulfill. So if we think about, and that's why I have the picture of the guy at the bottom there, if you think about people who are sleeping rough, who are homeless, prohibitions under, for example, public spaces protection orders against sleeping or lying on the streets, are impossible to fulfill for those who have no place else to sleep. So in a sense, we're going from what one might call broken windows policing to what I've called broken people policing. And again, I'm not entirely sure that that's the right term. Maybe it should be broken society. Anyhow, and then just because I have an interest in questions of security and terrorism, I'd add to the list, though again, maybe it's a bit marginal, a whole other set of categories of people who aren't simply marginalized or excluded. They're regarded as failed citizens, or in the words of the former Prime Minister David Cameron, as enemies of the state. And these might include people who are persistently offending, who are dangerous, sexual or violent offenders, but also up to and including would-be terrorists or other extremists. And I've listed for you there a whole series of categories of people who, or series of categories rather, of responses to people who fall under these headings of outlaws or enemies. So we have a category of internal exile under control orders, which were introduced in 2005 for those who were suspected of involvement in terrorist activity. The government introduced so-called forcible relocation, so you can be just removed from your house and made to go and live in a prescribed accommodation hundreds of miles away. That forcible relocation requirement was temporarily suspended, but reintroduced from 2012 and until 2015. It was reinserted under the successor control orders, which are called TPIMs, which are kind of control orders light, if you like. They've reintroduced forcible relocation to make it possible again to relocate people. And they're then subject to kind of partial curfews, surveillance, restrictions on movement, and so on. We have extended provisions of detention. So we have extended determinate sentencing provisions. We have indefinite sentences, and we now in the UK have whole life sentences, which are akin to LWOP in the United States. Mary, somebody's waiting to come in. And those really have the effect of exiling people, if you like, internally, or banishing them internally to the prison system. And then there are provisions also, as Mary and others have written about, or Mary principally, provisions for immigration detention in immigration removal centres, and then in respect to those who are regarded as threats to the security of the state, we have provisions under temporary exclusion orders under the 2015 Act to temporarily exclude people who are a threat, or indeed to seize the passports of those who would travel aboard for terrorist purposes. And something's gone wrong to my beautiful gold highlighting here, but never mind. We have citizenship stripping and deportation. Citizenship stripping is actually under UK law only permissible in respect of naturalised citizens under Section 67 of the 2014 Immigration Act. That hasn't stopped previous Home Secretaries from stripping citizenship from sole UK citizens, with the result that they are rendered stateless. The only requirement on the Home Secretary in respect of stripping of naturalised citizens is that the Home Secretary believes that that person poses a threat to the security of the state and has reasonable grounds to believe that they may be able to acquire the citizenship of another country. The problem with that is that may be able to acquire the citizenship of another country is an extremely vague set of terms and may have the effect of leaving that person entirely stateless. So they fall into a kind of legal black hole from which they cannot easily climb out, because they're nobody's responsibility, no state's responsibility, and in effect they have no rights at all. Of course, infamously, that was a provision that was applied to Shamima Begum. Shamima Begum was radicalized when she was a teenager at school and had her citizenship stripped when she was just 19, but not under the 2014 Immigration Act, which doesn't apply to her because she wasn't a naturalized citizen; she was a UK national. Go figure. Okay, so we have these whole categories of conditional or precarious or liminal, if you like, citizenship on the one hand, and then on the other we have something which applies potentially to all of us and everybody else, which is the ways in which, as state provision declines, as funding for policing is cut back, the state and the police increasingly have recourse to what's sometimes, I think, laughingly called the wider policing family, by which citizens, respectable citizens, in heavy inverted commas, are enlisted to protect themselves, their family, their property. Pat O'Malley developed this concept of responsibilization, which David Garland borrowed, to put it politely, without crediting Pat O'Malley. But anyway, this idea of responsibilizing people to take care of themselves, to deliver public goods and social care, to uphold civil order and security, not least, for example, by joining Neighbourhood Watch and other citizen-led groups. But we also have more recent laws which turn us into what I've called here vigilant citizens, as a slightly cheap reference to vigilantes there, which require, for example, under parental orders, parental duties are imposed upon families who are seen to be failing to police their children adequately, actually to control them and to be subject to sanction if not. And then we have a whole raft, really, of what Andrew Ashworth has called positive obligations in criminal law. That is, for those of you who aren't criminal lawyers, ordinarily it's quite rare for you to be held guilty of a crime for doing nothing. There are rather few limited crimes of omission. But what we've increasingly seen is this growth of positive duties on people, whereby if you don't fulfill those positive duties, i.e. you do nothing, then you will be guilty of an offence. So duties to report suspicious behaviour, duties to report illegal immigrants imposed upon landlords, employers, educational authorities, and so on. Anybody who fears or suspects that somebody's in breach of immigration regulations is under a legal duty to report, which is deeply problematic. We can discuss if you like. And then duties on institutions, preschools, schools, universities, prisons, hospitals, under the prevent duty and the protect duty, to report on people that they fear are at risk of being drawn into terrorism. I'm on an alerter service, and just today I got an email from one of the teacher unions, raising an issue raised by one of the teacher unions, which is what are the responsibilities of teachers to fulfill the prevent duty in respect of online teaching of primary school children. How do you go about identifying who's at risk of being drawn into terrorism if your interaction with them is by online teaching methods? Interesting question. In respect of all of these so-called positive legal duties, the breach of that duty is itself a crime, which is enforced by fines, but if you don't pay the fines, again, you're liable to imprisonment. So whilst I've said this is the enlisting of responsible citizens, the flip side of that is also that we are liable to be found irresponsible if we don't fulfill these positive duties, and we ourselves become criminals, liable to fines or even for non-payment imprisonment, if we don't act responsibly as required. For the students amongst you, you should realise that that's a duty that falls upon us as teachers in respect of our teaching of you. And my own students will be well aware of the fact that I'm acutely aware that when I ask you to go read reading lists on terrorism-related matters, generally that comes with a caveat about where you can and cannot safely go on the internet, because since February of last year, under the Counter-Terrorism Border Securities Act, it's a crime to view online on a single occasion material that may be of use to those planning or preparing a terrorist offence. That offence has a 15-year maximum sentence, and it's incumbent upon me, therefore, to tell my students that they could find themselves guilty of that if they were not careful. So there's a kind of dual aspect to this. On the one hand, we're regarded as responsible and respectable. On the other hand, we ourselves are being policed. And so that leaves open in my mind a bit of a question as to whether this is a kind of erosion of state sovereignty, or erosion of the sovereign state police power, or whether we should think about it rather as an extension of that police power. I'm still thinking about that bit. So I'm 2 minutes over, I apologise, but I'll be fast. In conclusion, and this was originally, of course, intended as a warning to my colleagues in the Nordic countries who'd gathered together in Oslo. The post-welfare state represents a state of unsafety, if you like, whereas we think maybe somewhat naively of welfare societies as promoting social insurance and the good life for all. What we see in post-welfare societies is a commitment to austerity, to cuts to social and indeed policing services, rising inequality, increased homelessness, poverty, and so on, in which preventive measures are taken, as I indicated earlier, to tackle the symptoms, but not really the deep causes of disorder and incivility. And to return to my earlier idea of abandoning a pure safety conception and thinking really about civil peace, I rather like this quote from an American legal scholar called Darrell Brown: "Peace is more than merely the absence of disorder. It is order on just terms achieved by legitimate means." So my lecture for Norway ended with this kind of warning, if you like, to Nordic countries about the experience of post-welfare societies. Just as a coda to that, as a postscript, and post-lockdown and the corona crisis, we might want to reflect on the fact that it's US and the United States of America and the United Kingdom who have by far the highest levels of mortality, the highest mortality rates per million of population. And I just wonder whether it isn't incumbent upon us as criminologists to reflect upon how some of the changes that I've sought to set out in this short talk actually have had ramifications for those who find themselves most marginalized in our societies as a result. Of all souls, even better.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.